But it's an odd world out there, and that as with political candidates, anything you say is going to offend somebody, rub somebody the wrong way. Since we're not political candidates, and we're after something besides mere votes, we go ahead and say it as eloquently as we can.
And I remember someone in a letter saying to me that she was amazed, she said, at how I could write poems out of, I think she put it, string and thread and bits of dust from under the bed.
And essentially with writing, one must find a way. It's a solitary business, is writing.
For these three, writing is more than putting words on a piece of paper. Hello, I'm Don Noble. Tonight, novelist John Barth, poet Marvin Bell, and fiction writer Shirley Grau talk about how writers see, work, think, and teach. It's a solitary business. John Barth, the author of 9 volumes of fiction, one of them a National Book Award winner, is primarily known as an experimenter, a writer always trying to tell a story in a new way, to see things differently. Barth once said, "God was a pretty good novelist, but he was a realist." It's easy to say that Barth is not a realist. It's harder to say what he is. He's been called a fabulist, a mythologist, and everything in between, including a Southern writer, since he lives and works in Maryland.
So let me give you an opportunity to put yourself on the record. Is there still a South? If so, is there still a thing called Southern literature? Should there be, and will there be for long? Take your pick of any of that.
Well, given the, the heterogeneity of the New South, in which half the denizens are likely to have come from Massachusetts or Nevada or somewhere up in the Rust Belt, given the enhanced mobility and let's call it cosmopolitanism of the South, obviously the kind of thing that Erskine Caldwell was doing and that William Faulkner was doing and Flannery O'Connor was doing, while it still describes certain features of the present South, is not as representative, God knows, as it was that time, back in that time. We surely do still find writers. One thinks of Bobby Ann Mason writing about Kentucky, for example. One thinks of an older generation still very much alive and doing their work, like Eudora Welty, let's say, who are Southern writers. There are some new young writers for whom the South is their imaginative geography just as strongly as it was for Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner and Carson McCullers and the rest. Though the material will, of course, be updated. People are going to be watching VCRs and not picking cotton, et cetera. The label has always fit me quite uncomfortably. Maryland, I historically was a border state, and I have always felt myself in this respect to be in a border state of one sort or another. While I learned a great deal from Faulkner as an apprentice, my main influences, insofar as one can trace such things, are not only not particularly our Southern writers, they're not particularly North American writers. I think I cut my teeth much more on the likes of James Joyce and Franz Kafka and Scheherazade and Cervantes and Rabelais than on Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe and so forth, though I recognize some like great uncles, great aunts among that ancestry.
In his early work, Barth was part existential philosopher, part historical novelist. Lately, though, he seems to be getting more personal.
Do you feel that you've become a more autobiographical writer in the last 3 books?
I don't think so. I don't know whether critics would agree. People like to read there is that kind of prurient interest that some readers and critics have in reading the author from the book. Though it's true that as I have gotten older, my protagonists have not gotten younger, let's say, and that in the last 2 novels, in the last 3 novels, which have been of a less fantastical mode, away from the mythologically inspired work that I was doing in the 60s and the early 70s, the authors have sometimes, enjoyed sailing, for example. I enjoy sailing. I always give them bigger sailboats and more ability than I have. This is one of the ways in which art compensates for life. In the case of the hero of my recentest novel, The Tidewater Tales, the chap is also a writer, but then I deliberately make him a minimalist rather than a maximalist, and there is a 700-and-some page novel about a minimalist author, so that's scarcely autobiographical.
Well, I guess I'm one of those critics who is looking for the autobiographical in sabbatical.
Why? Now that I've got you here and I'm interviewing you, why?
I don't know. It's a natural thing to do. If you have any idea of the broad outlines of the writer's life, and the writer moves from institution to institution, or remarries, or goes back to.
But then you never know where to stop. That
Yes,
chap, for
of course.
example, is a former CIA officer. I
Yeah,
swear
yes.
to you, I am not.
Well, of course you have to say that, don't you?
And he's had a heart attack. I haven't yet. The interview's not over, etc. And so where do you stop? You know, he's an aspiring novelist. I'm a professional novelist. His wife is a professor of American literature. I'm a professor of literature. So unless you're going to say Madame Bovary, c'est moi, you know, the fact is that there's a little bit of skin flakes from the author, I suppose, in all of his or her characters. That truism happens to be true. You're likely to find, you do in the case of the author you're speaking to now, that the differences are more impressive and more significant to me than. But even in a writer who works much closer to the bone of his own experience, such a writer as John Updike, for example, whom I very much admire, we know that if John Updike is undergoing a divorce, let's say, we're going to get a bunch of divorce stories about people about his age and about his economic class undergoing divorce. And of course, since he happens also to be an artist, he is going to know exactly how to transmute that material into fiction so that not one detail, presumably, in all those divorce stories is there simply because, I mean, its justification will never be just because the author himself happened to be undergoing a similar experience. That was on the front burner of his experience at the time, and so it was on the back burner of his imagination. But in the best cases, unfailingly transmuted into art, so that anything in the real experience that's inconsequential for the story will not be in there. Anything he needs to invent to make the story work is not a special pleading for the divorce case.
In the 1960s, Barth was fascinated with the problems of nihilism and meaninglessness. In The End of the Road, Jake Horner is contemplating a train trip when he is seized by the existential malady cosmopsis. So I left the ticket window and took a seat on one of the benches in the middle of the concourse to make up my mind. And it was there that I simply ran out of motives, as a car runs out of gas. There was no reason to go to Cincinnati, Ohio. There was no reason to go to Crestline, Ohio, or Dayton, Ohio, or Lima, Ohio. There was no reason either to go back to the Bradford Apartment Hotel, or for that matter, to go anywhere. There was no reason to do anything. My eyes, as the German classicist Winckelmann said inaccurately of the eyes of the Greek statues, were sightless, gazing on eternity, fixed on ultimacy. And when that is the case, there is no reason to do anything, even to change the focus of one's eyes, which is perhaps why the statue stands still. It is the malady cosmopsis, the cosmic view, that afflicted me. When one has it, one is frozen like the bullfrog when the hunter's light strikes him full in the eyes. Only with cosmopsis, there is no hunter, and no quick hand to terminate the moment. There's only the light.
Well, there was a day in the late 60s and early 70s when it looked as if the writing of Barthelme and Barth and Coover and Pynchon constituted the prevailing school or the prevailing mode of experimental fiction or avant-garde fiction. Do you sense that it is elsewhere now? And if so, where?
Oh yes, quite so. Though mind you, those of us that you just mentioned do not feel that we have finished with our careers, and indeed may feel that we're still, to the extent that we agree that we have anything in common, we may feel that we're still very much in the process of exploring the possibilities of the mode, whether you call it fabulism or postmodernism or what have you. But as anybody who coaches young writers in our republic knows, has had amply demonstrated, the swing of the pendulum has been away from that mode of writing toward the kind of, it has a half dozen names, kind of minimalist neo-realism, Diet Pepsi, minimalism, Kmart, blue collar, something. The popes of the church are, of course, those excellent writers, Raymond Carver and Ann Beattie, Donald Barthelme's younger brother, Frederick Barthelme, Mary Robinson. Some of these are students of mine, former students of mine. So I have a kind of benign attitude toward the whole phenomenon. They're good writers. They do that kind of name brand minimalism extremely well, and so I don't begrudge them or the public's taste the swing in another direction. That's the way literary generations go. Only it used to take 100 years, and now it takes about one presidential administration.
Since you bring it up, and I had planned to ask anyway, you have yourself been a student in a writing program, and you have for many years taught young writers. May I assume then that at some level or other, to some degree or other, you believe that writing can be taught?
It can be coached, and an important distinction has to be made between dealing with people on the bunny hill, let's say, and people on the advanced intermediate slopes who are trying to get to the expert slopes. In a university setting, and as I don't have to tell you, the United States is still the only country where this is done. We have 400 and some degree-granting programs in creative writing. There can't be more than about 4 in the rest of the world. You know, it's strictly a United States post-World War II phenomenon, but there's something to be said for it. In any case, when you're coaching, when you're dealing with beginning apprentices, there's a kind of teaching involved. They may not have read very much. You know, you encourage them to read lots of literature from lots of centuries. You show them how other artists in other times and countries have managed their effects. They will either learn or they won't. You know, they may learn to be better readers, which is no small accomplishment. On the other hand, the muses don't care about the difference between graduate students and undergraduates. They only care about talent and even genius. But universities do. If we pick advanced apprentices, then it's not so much teaching as coaching, and that has gone on in the art in every century, in every culture. Only here in America we do it under the fluorescent lights between 3 and 5 on Wednesday afternoon.
Maybe there's an export here that can help balance of payments.
We could use one, though I don't see any great sign on the part of the Japanese and the Germans and et cetera, interested as they are in post-war,
set up
postmodern
MFA programs
American lit,
all over
to
the world.
import the method as well. It may happen.
Marvin Bell has been teaching poetry writing at the celebrated University of Iowa workshop for a long time. He's the author of many volumes of poetry, distinguished for their breezy charm and wit. He tells the interviewer, Marcel Smith of the University of Alabama, that immediate publication is not the only objective in teaching writing.
You know, if someone's going to write, you can't keep them from it, okay? If they just think they want to write, well, life offers plenty of excuses to give up things one intended to do. I try to, all of us who do this sort of thing, I guess, try mostly to create a community effort, create the situation, the circumstances within which people will feel free to read things that would otherwise threaten them, write different ways, exchange ideas, gain a little confidence, gain the ability to look objectively or somewhat objectively at their work sometime after it's written, all that sort of thing. But there's no way to know who's going to be good. You know, I always feel, give me 10 years, give me 20 years, then I'll tell you who was going to be good. They're all going to be something. It isn't my idea that accomplishment is the goal. That's not my idea. Publication, accomplishment, getting the respect of people who appreciate one's accomplishment. That's not the goal for me. Those are bonuses one might cherish if they come along. But it has to do with something else. You know, it's a way of life. It's a way of speaking to oneself. It's a way of finding out what one didn't know one knew, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Are you, what sort of work schedule or work habits have you had to devise over the years in order to meet your requirements as a vocal coach and also to have time to write?
I believe in writing schedules for other people. I do. I really do believe in them for other people. And I would like to have one myself, but I haven't been able to do it that way. Now, I'm coming closer. I'm coming closer to it. But I've had to respond to things as they came up. Academic matters, literary matters, family matters, very personal matters. I've had to keep my head above water by reaching for whatever piece of wood came along. And that's the way I've been able to function. But I believe in regular writing habits. I think I write mostly at night. mostly from, say, dusk onward, but I believe I could write at any time, just a question of when it wells up, you know.
Right.
And I'm trying to learn to write regularly.
Do you have a couple that you could share with us here? One of the selected, and you might say a little bit about why you chose to include that one, what your instincts were.
I wrote this poem because I wanted to. That may sound odd, but as you well know, one writes when one has to, not necessarily when one wants to. And in this case, I thought, well, you know, Christmas was coming about 12 years ago. I'd written many poems that Dorothy appeared in or were dedicated to her or about her in some way, but I thought it would be nice if I could write a good one for a change. So I set out to write one. And the problem with a love poem is that everybody knows what a love poem says.
Right.
So I had to find somewhere else to begin. Now, I admit all this freely. This is my little poem to Dorothy. You are not beautiful exactly. You are beautiful inexactly. You let a weed grow by the mulberry, and a mulberry grow by the house. So close, in the personal quiet of a windy night, it brushes the wall and sweeps away the day till we sleep. A child said it, and it seemed true. Things that are lost are all equal. But it isn't true. If I lost you, the air wouldn't move nor the tree grow. Someone would pull the weed, my flower. The quiet wouldn't be yours. If I lost you, I'd have to ask the grass to let me sleep.
You have also with you, I believe, an interesting book that you put together with a friend. You want to say a little bit about this one?
This was fun. This is a book that the poet William Stafford and I wrote. We didn't set out to write a book. We set out to write poems back and forth. Makes the mail more interesting. So here came my poem. This was called Reflexes. There was a powder the druggist had. Used it on my hand when I squeezed a glass ornament at Christmas. I picked it up, and held it tighter. 3 stages I can still distinguish. Then I was holding a handful of blood. This man's oldest daughter died from a dormitory fire, famous at the time. She got out, then went back. She lay for days in the burn ward. She had been skinned alive, no chance. Her father, the pharmacist, understood. Sometimes you have to imagine the worst to prepare. The calm fire drill at school, or the desperate decisions that come in the dark. Which room, which child? We fuzz it up with heroics, charades. No one can picture the worst. And he replied with a poem called Serving with Gideon. Now I remember, in our town the druggist prescribed Coca-Cola mostly, in tapered glasses to us, and to the elevator man in a paper cup so he could drink it elsewhere because he was black. And now I remember the Legion, gambling in the back room, and no women but girls, old boys who ran the town. They were generous to their sons or the sons of friends. And of course, I was almost one. I remember winter light closing its great blue fist slowly eastward along the street, and the dark then, deep as war, arched over a radio show called The 30s in the great old USA. Look down, stars. I was almost one of the boys. My mother was folding her handkerchief. The library seethed and sparked. Right and wrong arced, and carefully I walked with my cup toward the elevator man. We got 2 kinds of reviews. We got one review that said, the wonderful thing about this book is that you can always tell exactly who's writing the poems. And the other review we got, the wonderful thing about this book is that you can never be sure who's writing which poem.
Shirley Ann Grau achieved early success with her novel, The Keepers of the House, which won her the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1964. She's continued to write and is a frequent participant in literary conferences and workshops, encouraging a new generation of writers. I wonder if you could give us some idea of what it is you're doing at these workshops at the Birmingham Southern Writers Conference.
I know what I try to do and what I think most teachers try to do. You can't teach writing in 1 hour, 2 hours, but what you can do, I think, is give the students a sense of what it is to be a writer, to give them some insight into the writing process so they can find their own way. And essentially with writing, one must find a way. It's a solitary business, this writing. It can't really be taught. Students can be helped along, but in the last analysis, you teach yourself, or not. And this is probably why there are so many washouts in the schools of writing. It's a pity because it's a marvelous way to see the world, and everything takes on a new meaning if you're thinking of it in terms of an interpreter in prose. It makes everything more meaningful, more alive. You look for meanings, and from the writer's side, from my side, I see things in a way I know I wouldn't see them if I were not thinking about writing about them. So it's a good thing for me too. But I can tell the students that. I can't necessarily tell them even technique. Many hours by yourself. Period where I could keep office hours. It would be marvelous. But
Called her for her habit of sitting silent and still in corners, stickiness that was the breath of the ground itself. While her mother's feet thudded up and down across the boards overhead, she lay on her back and watched the spiders weaving.
Going to be a short story.
Durable and generic difference between novel and short story. I know that because a lot of detailed work. Its power comes from the size and the elaboration of detail.
And Virginia Caldwell.